The rope burned against her wrists like judgment itself. Sarah Mackenzie had believed her father's sermons about divine protection until the raiders left her bound to the weathered post where cattle were once sold. The desert sun carved shadows across the abandoned market square, while buzzards circled overhead like dark prayers. Her white dress, torn and stained with dust and tears, fluttered in the merciless wind. When the Apache warrior emerged from the heat shimmer carrying bread, she understood that God's mercy sometimes wore war paint and moved on silent feet through a world that had forgotten the meaning of sanctuary. The morning had begun with her father's voice echoing through the small wooden church, his words about divine providence floating over the congregation like incense. Sarah Mackenzie had sat in the front pew, her hands folded in perfect prayer position, believing every syllable that fell from Reverend Mackenzie's lips about God's protection for the righteous. The sunlight streaming through the single stained glass window painted rainbow fragments across her white cotton dress, and she had felt blessed, chosen, wrapped in the certainty that faith was armor enough against the darkness of the frontier. Her mother's Bible lay open in her lap, the pages worn soft from countless readings, and Sarah traced the familiar verses with her fingertip while her father spoke of lambs safely gathered in the fold. The congregation murmured their amens, and she had smiled, secure in the knowledge that she was loved by heaven itself. But heaven had looked away when the raiders came thundering into town just after the noon meal. Sarah had been hanging laundry behind the parsonage when the first shots rang out, the wet sheets snapping in the wind like surrender flags. Her father's voice, which had been so strong from the pulpit hours before, cracked like dry wood when he called her name across the chaos of screaming horses and shouting men. She dropped the wooden pins and ran toward his voice, her bare feet slipping on the dusty ground, but rough hands caught her before she could reach the safety of his arms. The last thing she saw of her father was his face pressed against the church window, his mouth moving in what might have been prayer or might have been her name. The raiders bound her hands with rope that smelled of horses and sweat and threw her across a saddle like a sack of grain, carrying her away from everything she had ever known or trusted. They left her tied to the market post when they rode out of town, their saddlebags heavy with whatever they could steal from the good people of Cedar Ridge. The post stood in the center of the abandoned square, its wood bleached white by years of desert sun, and carved with the initials of cowboys and cattle buyers who had long since moved on to other towns, other lives. Sarah's wrists burned where the rope cut into her skin, and she could taste blood where she had bitten her tongue to keep from screaming. The white dress her mother had sewn for her 16th birthday was torn at the shoulder, and dust had turned the pristine cotton the color of old bones. She pulled against the bonds until her wrists were raw, but the knots held fast, tied by men who knew their business when it came to keeping things from escaping. The sun climbed higher, turning the market square into a furnace of heat and silence. Sarah's lips cracked and her throat felt like sandpaper, but she forced herself to recite the 23rd Psalm, the words her father had made her memorize when she was still small enough to sit on his knee. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she whispered, but the words felt hollow in the empty air, like prayers spoken into a void that had forgotten how to listen. The buildings around the square stood empty, their windows dark and accusing, and she wondered if anyone was left alive to hear her if she called for help. A tumbleweed rolled past her feet, and she watched it disappear down the dusty street, envying its freedom to move with the wind. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to understand that her father's sermons about divine protection might have been beautiful lies told to comfort children in a world too harsh for truth. The rope around her wrists had rubbed her skin raw, and flies buzzed around the dried blood, but she no longer had the strength to shake them away. Her head hung forward, and her dark hair fell across her face like a curtain, hiding her tears from the empty square. She thought of her mother, dead these 3 years from fever, and wondered if she was watching from heaven, powerless to help her daughter in this moment of abandonment. The market post creaked in the wind, and Sarah closed her eyes, trying to remember what it felt like to believe that someone was watching over her. When she opened her eyes again, the shadows had grown longer, and buzzards circled overhead like dark angels waiting for permission to descend. Sarah Mackenzie, the preacher's daughter, who had never doubted God's love until this moment, hung her head and wept for the innocence that had died with the morning light. The rope held her fast to the post, but it was her faith that felt most thoroughly broken, scattered like dust in the desert wind that carried no prayers back to heaven. The heat shimmer rose from the desert floor like the breath of sleeping giants, distorting the horizon until earth and sky became one wavering line of impossible blue. Sarah had stopped pulling against the rope hours ago, her strength drained by the merciless sun and the growing certainty that she would die here, forgotten and alone in this abandoned square. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she tried to swallow, her throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. The white dress clung to her skin, soaked with sweat and fear, and she could smell her own desperation rising like heat from sun-baked earth. She had prayed until the words lost all meaning, until even the familiar comfort of Scripture felt like stones in her mouth, heavy and useless against the weight of her abandonment. It was then that she saw him emerging from the heat, shimmer like a vision born of delirium and despair. At first, she thought her mind had finally broken under the strain, conjuring phantoms to ease her dying moments. The figure moved with the fluid grace of water flowing over stone, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth of the square. His skin was the color of burnished copper, and his long black hair was bound with leather and feathers that caught the light like dark flames. War paint marked his cheeks in patterns that spoke of battles fought and enemies conquered, and Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. She had heard the stories whispered in church socials about Apache warriors, tales of savagery and bloodshed that made children hide behind their mothers' skirts. But this warrior carried no weapons in his hands, only a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, still warm from some distant fire. He approached her slowly, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with her torn dress or bound hands. Sarah pressed herself back against the post, the rough wood scraping against her shoulders, and tried to make herself smaller, invisible, anything but the helpless prey she had become. The warrior stopped just beyond arm's reach, and for a long moment, they stared at each other across the gulf of fear and misunderstanding that separated their worlds. His eyes held no cruelty, no hunger for violence, only a deep sadness that seemed to echo her own despair. When he spoke, his voice was like wind moving through canyon walls, low and resonant with an accent that turned English words into something almost musical. "You are the holy man's daughter," he said. And it was not a question, but a statement of fact that somehow carried the weight of recognition and sorrow. Sarah nodded, unable to find her voice, and watched as he unwrapped the bread with hands that were scarred from battles she could not imagine. The smell of the warm bread made her stomach clench with hunger, but she was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this moment of unexpected mercy was anything more than another cruel dream. The warrior tore off a piece of the bread and held it out to her, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. "Why?" Sarah whispered, the words scraping past her damaged throat like a prayer she was afraid to voice. The warrior's eyes softened, and for a moment she saw past the war paint and the fearsome reputation to something achingly human underneath. He did not answer her question with words, but instead moved closer, close enough that she could smell the sage and smoke that clung to his buckskin shirt, close enough to see the silver threads that time had woven through his black hair. With gentle fingers, he placed the bread against her lips, and Sarah opened her mouth like a communion communicant receiving grace from the most unlikely priest. The bread was sweet and warm, and as she chewed, tears ran down her cheeks, salt mixing with the simple gift of sustenance. The Apache warrior watched her eat with the patience of stone, his presence both terrifying and oddly comforting in the vast emptiness of the abandoned square. When she had finished the bread, he produced a water skin and held it to her lips, letting the precious liquid flow slowly so she would not choke. Sarah drank deeply, feeling life return to her parched throat, and when she was finished, she looked up into his eyes and saw something that made her heart skip with a hope she had thought was dead. He reached for the ropes that bound her wrists, his fingers working at the knots with surprising gentleness, and Sarah Mackenzie understood that sometimes salvation came not from the pulpit or the prayer book, but from the hands of strangers who chose mercy over vengeance, in a world that had forgotten the meaning of both. The days that followed moved like honey through cracked glass, each hour stretching into an eternity of whispered conversations and averted eyes. Sarah found herself walking the same dusty paths she had known since childhood, but now every familiar corner held the echo of rope burns and the phantom taste of fear. The townspeople nodded their greetings with the same mechanical politeness they had always shown the preacher's daughter, yet something had shifted in the space between their words and their glances. She could feel their curiosity pressing against her like desert heat, their unspoken questions hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The market post stood empty now, its weathered wood bearing no visible trace of what had transpired, but Sarah could not pass it without feeling the ghost of hemp against her wrists. Her father's sermons had taken on a different cadence, his voice carrying a tremor that spoke of prayers offered in the dark hours before dawn, when even the strongest faith could feel as fragile as morning frost. The Apache warrior had vanished as silently as he had appeared, leaving behind only the memory of dark eyes that had seen too much and hands that had chosen kindness over conquest. Sarah found herself scanning the horizon during her evening walks, searching for a figure that would never materialize, yet unable to stop herself from hoping. The bread he had brought her had been coarse and unfamiliar, tasting of wild herbs and distant campfires, but she had eaten every crumb with a reverence usually reserved for communion wafers. Her mother had noticed the change in her, the way Sarah's fingers would unconsciously trace the faded marks on her wrists, the way she would pause mid-sentence as if listening for something only she could hear. The questions came in gentle waves, concern wrapped in maternal intuition, but Sarah found herself unable to translate the experience into words that would not sound like madness or blasphemy. How could she explain that in her moment of greatest terror, salvation had come not from the God her father preached about, but from a man her people called savage? The town's rhythm continued its eternal dance of commerce and gossip, but Sarah felt herself moving through it like a ghost, present but not quite belonging. The other young women her age spoke of upcoming harvest dances and potential suitors, their conversations flowing around her like water around a stone. She tried to participate, to summon the enthusiasm that had once come so naturally, but the words felt hollow in her mouth, empty vessels that could not contain the weight of what she now carried. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had taken to watching her with the sharp eyes of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the signs of a soul that had been fundamentally altered. The older woman's knowing glances held no judgment, only the quiet understanding of someone who had witnessed the way life could pivot on a single moment, transforming the familiar into the foreign, with the cruel efficiency of a desert storm. Sarah began to understand that some experiences existed beyond the reach of language, residing in the spaces between heartbeats where truth lived too large for words. The evening shadows grew longer as autumn approached, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust that reminded Sarah of the warrior's skin in the fading light. She had begun to dream of vast spaces and endless skies, of campfires that spoke in languages older than the Bible, of a freedom that existed beyond the boundaries of her small world. These dreams came to her in fragments, The sound of horses moving through sagebrush, the taste of water from hidden springs, the feeling of wind that had never known the confines of wooden walls or social expectations. She would wake from these visions with tears on her cheeks and a longing in her chest that felt both foreign and familiar, as if she were remembering a life she had never lived. Her father noticed her distraction during morning prayers, the way her eyes would drift toward the window, where the desert stretched endlessly toward horizons that promised both danger and possibility. He attributed her restlessness to the trauma she had endured, never suspecting that his daughter was not recovering from her ordeal, but rather discovering that it had awakened something in her that could never again be put to sleep. The Apache warrior's act of mercy had planted seeds in soil that had been prepared by years of quiet rebellion against the narrow confines of her prescribed existence. Sarah began to see her world through different eyes, noticing the way the townspeople's fear of the unknown had calcified into hatred, the way their faith had become a fortress rather than a bridge. She watched her father deliver sermons about love and forgiveness, while the same congregation that nodded their agreement would speak of Indians with venom in their voices and violence in their hearts. The contradiction sat in her stomach like a stone, growing heavier with each passing day, until she could no longer pretend not to see the chasm between what was preached and what was practiced. The warrior had shown her more of Christ's love in a single act of unexpected kindness than she had witnessed in years of Sunday services, and this realization filled her with a grief so profound it felt like mourning for her own innocence. She understood now that the world was not divided into the neat categories of good and evil that her upbringing had promised, but was instead painted in shades of grey that required a different kind of faith to navigate. The weight of this new understanding settled into her bones like winter cold, changing the way she moved through her days and the way she interpreted the familiar rituals of her life. Sarah Mackenzie was learning that some rescues were not about being saved from danger, but about being awakened to possibilities that had always existed just beyond the edges of what she had been taught to see. October arrived with the whisper of change, bringing cooler nights and the promise of winter's approach. But for Sarah, the season's turning felt like an echo of the transformation already taking place within her own heart. She had begun to spend her afternoons in the small cemetery behind the church, where weathered headstones told stories of lives cut short by the harsh realities of frontier existence. Among these silent witnesses, she found a peace that eluded her in the crowded spaces of town, where every conversation felt like a performance and every smile required effort she no longer possessed. The graves spoke to her of impermanence and the futility of clinging too tightly to the familiar, lessons that seemed to arrive just when she needed them most. Her fingers would trace the carved names and dates, wondering about the dreams these people had carried, and whether any of them had ever felt the pull of horizons that lay beyond the boundaries of acceptable existence. The wind that moved through the cemetery carried scents from the desert, sage and dust, and something wild that made her heart race with unnamed possibilities. Her relationship with her father had begun to shift in ways that neither of them fully understood, the easy intimacy of their shared faith now complicated by questions she could not voice and doubts she could not confess. Reverend Mackenzie continued to treat her with the gentle concern of a parent tending a wounded child, never suspecting that his daughter's injury was not to her body, but to her understanding of the world he had so carefully constructed around her. During their evening conversations, Sarah found herself listening to his words as if hearing them for the first time, noticing the certainty in his voice when he spoke of God's plan and the righteous path, a certainty she could no longer share. She loved him deeply, but she was beginning to understand that love did not require agreement, and that the most profound acts of devotion sometimes involved growing beyond what those we cherish can comprehend. The realization filled her with a loneliness so complete it felt like drowning in air, surrounded by people who spoke her language, but could no longer understand her meaning. The Apache warrior's absence had become a presence in her life, a constant reminder of roads not taken and possibilities unexplored. Sarah caught herself imagining conversations with him, wondering what he would think of her small town's rituals and assumptions, how he would interpret the contradictions she was only now beginning to see. She pictured him moving through landscapes she had never witnessed, living according to laws written in the movement of stars and the changing of seasons, rather than in the pages of books that claim to contain all truth. These fantasies brought her both comfort and torment, offering glimpses of a freedom she could taste but not touch, a life that existed just beyond the reach of her courage. She began to understand that rescue could be the cruelest gift of all, showing someone what was possible while leaving them trapped in what was actual. The warrior had not just saved her life, he had shown her that there were other ways of being human, other definitions of home and family and purpose that had nothing to do with the narrow confines of her inherited existence. The town's social fabric continued to weave itself around her, but Sarah felt increasingly like a thread that no longer matched the pattern, creating tension in places where there had once been seamless integration. The young men who had once sought her attention now seemed like children playing at adulthood, their conversations about land ownership and business prospects striking her as elaborate games that missed the point of living entirely. She tried to summon interest in their courtship rituals, to play the role of the eligible daughter that her position demanded, but the performance felt increasingly hollow. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, had begun making pointed comments about the importance of young women settling down before they developed too many independent ideas, her words carrying the weight of social pressure disguised as maternal concern. Sarah smiled and nodded at these pronouncements while feeling something wild and untamed stirring in her chest, a rebellion that grew stronger with each attempt to contain it. She was beginning to understand that some cages were built not with bars, but with expectations, and that the most insidious prisons were those that convinced their inmates they were free. The dreams that had begun after her rescue now came with increasing frequency and vividness, transporting her to landscapes that felt more real than her waking life. In these nocturnal journeys, she rode horses across endless plains, slept under stars that seemed close enough to touch, and spoke in languages that bypassed words entirely. She would wake from these visions with tears on her cheeks and a longing so intense it felt like physical pain, as if her soul were trying to escape the confines of her body and return to a home she had never known but somehow remembered. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur, with moments of déjà vu striking her at unexpected times, the sight of clouds moving across the desert sky, the sound of wind through sagebrush, the feeling of space so vast it made her small-town concerns seem insignificant. These experiences left her feeling like a stranger in her own life, going through the motions of being the preacher's daughter, while her true self wandered in territories that existed beyond the maps her community had drawn of the world. The weight of unspoken truth began to settle into her bones like winter cold, changing not just how she saw the world, but how she moved through it, until even her own reflection seemed to belong to someone she was still learning to recognize. Sarah Mackenzie was discovering that some awakenings could not be undone, and that the price of seeing clearly was the loss of the comfortable blindness that had once made her small world feel like enough. November brought the first frost, and with it a crystalline clarity that seemed to settle over the desert like a blessing, transforming the familiar landscape into something both beautiful and strange. Sarah stood at her bedroom window in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the way moonlight turned the distant mountains into silver silhouettes against a star-drunk sky, and felt the last of her resistance crumble like autumn leaves beneath winter's touch. The decision that had been building in her heart for weeks finally took shape, not as a sudden revelation, but as the natural conclusion of a journey that had begun the moment an Apache warrior had chosen mercy over vengeance. She understood now that some gifts could only be honored by accepting their full implications, and that the life he had saved was not meant to be lived within the same boundaries that had once defined her existence. The realization brought not fear, but a profound sense of rightness, as if she were finally aligning herself with a truth that had been waiting patiently for her to discover it. Her reflection in the window glass showed a young woman she barely recognized, someone whose eyes held depths that had not existed before, whose face carried the quiet strength of someone who had looked into the abyss and chosen to step forward rather than retreat. The preparations she made were small and careful, each decision weighted with the knowledge that there would be no returning from the path she was choosing. Sarah gathered her few precious possessions: her mother's silver locket, the worn Bible that had been her confirmation gift, a handful of coins saved from years of careful economy, and wrapped them in a shawl that had belonged to her grandmother. She wrote letters that would never be sent, trying to explain the unexplainable to people who loved her, but could never understand the language her heart had learned to speak. The words felt inadequate, pale shadows of the truth that burned in her chest like a sacred fire, but she wrote them anyway, knowing that someday her father might need to believe that his daughter had not abandoned her faith, but had simply discovered that God was larger than the church that claimed to contain him. The act of writing became a form of prayer, a way of blessing those she was leaving behind while asking forgiveness for the pain her departure would cause. She folded the letters carefully and placed them in her dresser drawer, where they would be found after she was gone. Small monuments to a love that transcended understanding. The town slept peacefully around her as she made her final preparations, unaware that one of their own was preparing to step beyond the boundaries of their shared world into territories that existed only in whispered stories and fearful imaginings. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, memorizing the creaks of familiar floorboards and the way lamplight painted shadows on walls that had sheltered her entire life. She paused in the doorway of her parents' bedroom, listening to their quiet breathing, and felt her heart break and heal simultaneously as she understood that this was how love sometimes worked, by letting go of what you cherish most in order to honor what it had taught you about courage. The weight of their dreams for her future pressed against her chest like a physical thing, but she had learned to distinguish between the expectations others carried and the calling that whispered in her own soul. Her father had taught her to listen for God's voice. He had simply never imagined that it might lead his daughter away from everything he held sacred. The desert welcomed her with the silence of ancient understanding, its vast spaces offering the kind of freedom that could only be found beyond the reach of human judgment and social convention. Sarah walked steadily eastward, following paths that seemed to appear beneath her feet, as if the earth itself were guiding her journey toward a destiny she could feel, but not yet see. The stars above her head told stories in languages older than words, and she found herself understanding their meaning in ways that bypassed rational thought, as if the warrior's act of kindness had awakened senses she had never known she possessed. The cold bit at her exposed skin, but she felt warmed by a fire that burned from within, sustained by the certainty that she was finally moving in the direction her soul had always wanted to go. Each step carried her further from the life she had known and closer to possibilities that shimmered on the horizon, like mirages that might prove to be real. The fear she had expected to feel never materialized. Instead, she experienced a profound sense of homecoming, as if she were not leaving her life behind, but finally beginning to live it. The sun rose behind her as she walked, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to celebrate her courage, and Sarah understood that some journeys could only be taken alone, in the space between one breath and the next, when the heart finally found the strength to follow where the spirit had always wanted to lead. She thought of the Apache warrior who had unknowingly set her free, wondering if he could sense that his act of mercy was still rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, creating circles of change that would touch lives he would never know. The bread he had given her had nourished more than her body. It had fed a hunger she had not known she carried, a starvation for authenticity that could only be satisfied by the courage to live according to her own understanding of what it meant to be human. The desert stretched endlessly before her, vast and dangerous and beautiful, offering no guarantees except the promise that whatever she found there would be real in ways that her previous life had never been. She walked steadily toward the rising sun, leaving behind footprints that the wind would soon erase, but carrying within her heart a story that would endure long after the desert had reclaimed all evidence of her passage. The horizon called to her with a voice that sounded like freedom, and Sarah Mackenzie answered with the whole of her being, finally understanding that some rescues were not about being saved from danger, but about being awakened to the courage necessary to save oneself. The preacher's daughter had become something new under the vast sky, something that had no name in the language of her birth, but sang with the truth of who she had always been meant to be.